March 5, 1947. Moscow. The last traces of winter still clung to the streets, gray slush pooling along the curbs as men in heavy coats filed through the gates of Lubyanka Square. Inside the old Tsarist insurance building, the one that had become the beating heart of Soviet fear, a new kind of war was beginning. The Second World War had ended less than 2 years earlier, but in the corridors of the Kremlin, a colder, more secret conflict was already taking shape. The Soviet Union had survived Hitler's invasion at unimaginable cost. 26 million dead, cities leveled, families erased. Yet victory had given Joseph Stalin something greater than revenge. It had given him reach. The Red Army now occupied half of Europe, from Berlin to Bucharest. And in those conquered capitals, Soviet officers were doing more than keeping order. They were gathering names, wiring rooms, and laying the foundations of a vast intelligence machine that would soon be called the KGB. In one smoke-filled chamber, a dozen men sat at a long oak table. Lavrenti Beria's successors in the secret police, the MGB, were presenting a proposal to reorganize Soviet security into something sharper, more disciplined, more global. Reports of the Americans forming their own Central Intelligence Agency had reached Moscow. Stalin wanted his own mirror image, but with teeth. From the rubble of the NKVD and MGB, the new Committee for State Security would rise. Outside, in a cramped office lit by a single bulb, a young officer named Ivan Serov read his first assignment: coordinate political supervision in the occupied zones of Germany. That meant hunting Western agents, recruiting informants, and ensuring the communist governments of Eastern Europe never wavered in their loyalty to Moscow. Serov didn't yet know it, but he would become the first chairman of the KGB and the architect of its doctrine: absolute control through absolute secrecy. Across the Atlantic, the West was celebrating peace. In Washington, President Truman was dismantling wartime intelligence units, even as Soviet networks were quietly expanding inside the United States. Former OSS officers warned of infiltration, but few listened. Not until a quiet British cipher clerk named Igor Guzenko defected in Ottawa in 1945, carrying documents that proved a massive Soviet spy ring was already operating in North America. His testimony shook Western governments. It exposed names like Klaus Fuchs, the physicist who had given the Soviets critical details of the Manhattan Project. Thanks to those leaks, Stalin's scientists detonated their own atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of schedule. By the early 1950s, paranoia was policy. The Iron Curtain had descended, dividing Europe with wire and watchtowers. In London, MI6 raced to identify moles after the shock revelation that two of its own, Kim Philby and Donald McLean, were Soviet agents. In Langley, the newly formed CIA tried to build networks behind the curtain, only to watch them collapse one by one. Most were betrayed before they even began. Somewhere in the British Embassy in Washington, Philby was reading the reports and passing them straight to Moscow. The KGB didn't just outspy its rivals, it outweighted them, turning every failure of the West into proof of its own inevitability. The operations that followed blurred the line between war and peace. In Hungary, agents posing as reconstruction engineers compiled dossiers on political leaders. In Czechoslovakia, propaganda teams infiltrated newspapers to steer public opinion. Every defector who escaped told the same story. Nothing happened in Eastern Europe without Moscow's knowledge. From the cellars of Lubyanka to the alleys of Vienna, a new kind of battlefield had formed. One fought with microphones, forged passports, and fear. The KGB's first generation believed they were the unseen soldiers of the revolution, guardians of a world that must remain forever secret. And somewhere in that frozen logic of power, a doctrine took hold. The enemy is everywhere, and victory belongs to those who can hide longest in the dark.
October 23, 1956. Budapest. Smoke rolled across the Danube as Soviet tanks ground through the cobblestone streets. Students and factory workers had risen against communist rule, and for 72 hours it looked as if the uprising might succeed. But the Kremlin had already made its decision. Deep inside the Hungarian Interior Ministry, agents from Moscow's first chief directorate were at work compiling arrest lists. They moved through captured radio stations and party offices, marking names in pencil: journalists, professors, union organizers. The orders came directly from Ivan Serov, now the KGB's first chairman. His message to his men was simple: control is restored only when no one else can speak. By November, the streets were quiet. The secret arrests began before dawn, the trucks loading prisoners at random. Some were shot, others vanished into the labor camps of the East. The rebellion was crushed, and the KGB had learned a lesson that would define its next 3 decades. Fear was the most efficient form of governance. In the years that followed, the KGB expanded like a nervous system stretching across continents. The first chief directorate oversaw foreign intelligence. The second hunted traitors at home. The fifth monitored ideology: artists, scientists, anyone with ideas that didn't fit the party line. Every Soviet citizen was a potential informant, every phone line a possible microphone. But the Cold War wasn't just fought in the alleys of Eastern Europe. It was fought in hotel rooms, airports, and embassies from Cairo to Copenhagen. Western journalists traveling to Moscow found their rooms bugged and their guides suspiciously well-informed. In the shadows, KGB illegals, agents operating under false identities with no diplomatic protection, slipped quietly into Western cities. They were engineers, translators, or businessmen by day, but their briefcases carried encrypted messages, microfilm, and code names. In 1960, one of the most audacious Soviet intelligence operations took place thousands of feet above Sverdlovsk. An American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The wreckage was paraded through Red Square. The message to the world was unmistakable. Soviet airspace was impregnable, and its intelligence arm omnipresent. Yet inside Moscow, the paranoia was turning inward. The KGB's second chief directorate began a massive campaign to root out Western influence within the Soviet elite. They monitored professors for reading Western journals, students for listening to jazz, and even party members for jokes about Khrushchev. Files grew thicker, and prisons filled again. At the same time, far beyond the Kremlin's walls, its reach grew deadlier. In Munich, Ukrainian dissident Stepan Bandera collapsed in his apartment after meeting a stranger on the stairwell. Autopsy reports listed heart failure, but a later investigation revealed the truth. A cyanide gas pistol fired at close range by a KGB assassin named Bogdan Stashinsky. 2 years later, he killed another target the same way. When Stashinsky defected to the West in 1961, his confession exposed the KGB's 13th Department, its Executive Action Unit, responsible for what Moscow called mokrie dela, wet affairs. The revelation shocked the world, but changed nothing. Inside the Lubyanka, operations simply continued under a new name, Department V. Its agents perfected poisons, mechanical devices, and silent weapons. Their training grounds outside Moscow became laboratories of deception. By the mid-1960s, espionage had become the era's defining currency. In Washington, the CIA and FBI tried to catch up, pouring resources into covert operations. In Moscow, the KGB countered with disinformation campaigns designed to fracture trust between allies. One infamous campaign, Operation Infection, would later plant the false story that the U.S. Army had created the AIDS virus. It was only one of hundreds of active measures designed to erode Western confidence from within. But even as the machinery of espionage turned more sophisticated, something else was changing. The agents who carried out these missions were no longer driven purely by ideology. Many began to see the contradictions of the system they served. Some looked west with envy, others with quiet hope. And one of them, a young officer from Moscow stationed in East Berlin, was already beginning to doubt everything the party had taught him. His name was Oleg Gordievsky.
August 13, 1961, East Berlin. The night smelled of damp concrete and diesel. Soviet soldiers unrolled barbed wire across the streets while floodlights lit the faces of families divided by a sudden wall. Young KGB officer Oleg Gordievsky watched from a nearby rooftop, the bright glare reflecting in his glasses as the first bricks were laid. Officially, this was a defensive measure against Western provocation. In truth, it was a prison wall built for an empire afraid of its own people. The morning after, KGB field units fanned through the eastern half of the city. Their task was simple: document anyone attempting to cross, recruit informants, and monitor the reaction of the West. Gordievsky wrote his first field report that day. It was clinical, factual, and even then, it made him uneasy. He had joined the service as his father had before him, believing it was a sacred duty to protect socialism. But what he saw in Berlin looked less like protection and more like containment. By the mid-1960s, the Berlin Wall had become the most visible scar of the Cold War. But the real battle unfolded in the shadows. The KGB and the CIA fought for control of defectors, trade secrets, and ideology itself. Every embassy was a potential front line, every cultural exchange a possible cover. Western diplomats carried miniature transmitters. Soviet agents posed as journalists and scholars. A handshake could be the start of an operation. Across Europe, the KGB's first chief directorate refined the use of illegals, deep cover operatives with perfect Western identities. They spoke fluent English, carried authentic passports, and lived for decades behind enemy lines. Some were so deeply embedded that even their own handlers never learned their real names. The West, for its part, responded in kind. MI6 and the CIA trained new generations of case officers to infiltrate the Eastern Bloc. Dozens disappeared without a trace. In 1968, the cycle of repression returned to Prague. Citizens demanded reform, free press, and democracy. The Kremlin's answer came in the form of 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops. While tanks rolled into the capital, the KGB executed the invisible part of the operation, Operation Danube. Gordievsky, now a rising officer, studied the reports that crossed his desk. KGB agents had entered the city weeks before disguised as tourists, journalists, and aid workers. They sabotaged radio broadcasts, spread disinformation about a fascist coup, and created pretexts for invasion. Once the troops arrived, they detained reformist leaders in a matter of hours. The precision was terrifying. Back in Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev praised the success as proof that socialism was secure. But inside the service, cracks were forming. Younger officers like Gordievsky saw the cynicism for what it was. They were told they were defending peace, yet their mission seemed built only on paranoia. Files crossed their desks detailing the brutal interrogations of students, the blackmail of diplomats, and the psychological warfare against writers who dared to criticize the regime. Still, the machine moved on. In the 1970s, the KGB reached its global peak. Its operatives were stationed in nearly every major capital. In Washington, they cultivated sources within defense contractors and research labs. In Paris and Bonn, they stole NATO communication codes. In Africa and Latin America, they trained local intelligence services in exchange for loyalty to Moscow. The KGB's strength lay not only in its resources, but in its patience. It could wait years for a single payoff. It could turn a Western academic into an asset with a quiet word, a generous stipend, or a subtle threat. In the back rooms of embassies, they traded ideology for leverage, friendship for compromise. But while the Soviet Union seemed invincible on the surface, a quiet disillusionment spread through its ranks. By the late 1970s, the economy faltered, the party ossified, and corruption spread from the factories to the Politburo. Many inside the KGB knew it, but said nothing. The files labeled Sovershino Sekretno, top secret, began to tell a different story, one of stagnation, fear, and decay. And somewhere in the midst of it all, in a drab CIA office thousands of miles away, an American analyst named Aldrich Ames was beginning a career that, decades later, would tear the CIA's Soviet operations apart from within. April 16, 1985. Washington, D.C. The cherry blossoms were beginning to fall along the Potomac, the petals drifting like pale snow. Inside a nondescript office building off Route 123, Aldrich Ames adjusted his tie in the mirror of the CIA's Soviet East European Division. He looked tired, unremarkable, the kind of man who blended in so well that no one really saw him. On his desk lay a classified folder marked Soviet Assets, compartmented. Within hours, the contents of that file would be in the hands of the KGB. Ames had spent over 20 years in the agency. His father had been a CIA officer before him, a man who'd taught him the trade but never earned real respect inside Langley. Rick was following the same path, modest postings, average reviews, and quiet drinking that turned into an open secret. Colleagues saw him as sloppy but harmless, the perfect cover for what he was about to become. That afternoon, he drove to Wisconsin Avenue, parked a few blocks from the Soviet embassy, and walked the rest of the way, hands buried in his coat pockets. Security cameras watched him from every angle, but he wasn't afraid. No one expected a CIA officer to approach the enemy's door. At 1 p.m., he entered the embassy lobby and asked to speak with a political officer. When the KGB staffer arrived, Ames handed over an envelope. Inside were the names of every Soviet double agent working for the United States. His price? $50,000. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes. He left, heart hammering, and drove back to Langley as if nothing had happened. That night, he poured himself a drink, looked at his reflection, and told himself it was a one-time thing, a way to clear his debts, to impress Rosario, the Colombian woman he'd fallen for and later married. But in truth, something inside him had shifted. He had crossed a line no one comes back from. Within weeks, the first of the Soviet informants began disappearing. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov were recalled to Moscow and executed. Others simply vanished into the silence of Lefortovo prison. The CIA's networks in Eastern Europe collapsed almost overnight. At first, the agency blamed faulty tradecraft. Then they blamed new Soviet counterintelligence technology. No one suspected Ames. He was still sitting at his desk, reading reports about the very damage he had caused. He had access to everything: communication channels, dead drop locations, even the schedules of his colleagues. His position in the counterintelligence center allowed him to control which cases were investigated and which were quietly shelved. Each time an inquiry came close to him, he redirected it. He even volunteered to help hunt the mole, himself. By 1986, Ames had become the KGB's most valuable asset. They called him Kallistrat. He provided the entire blueprint of U.S. intelligence operations against the Soviet Union: agents, recruitment methods, intercepts, budgets, even details of satellite programs. The KGB paid him in cash, millions over 9 years, delivered in brown paper bags during lunches at Georgetown restaurants. He used it to buy a $500,000 house, luxury suits, and a Jaguar. He told co-workers his wife's family was wealthy. No one questioned it. Inside Moscow's Lubyanka headquarters, the names Ames delivered were read aloud in small, soundproof rooms. Each one represented a life, someone who had risked everything to betray the Soviet state. Now they were betrayed in turn. The head of Directorate K, Viktor Cherkasin, called Ames a treasure beyond measure. His intelligence was so precise it caused suspicion within the KGB itself. Some thought it had to be disinformation, but the arrests proved otherwise.
For the CIA, it was the darkest chapter in its history. By the early 1990s, nearly every Soviet operation had failed. The agency's human intelligence capability inside the USSR was effectively dead. Ames continued undetected, cool and confident, even passing 2 polygraph tests by remaining calm and friendly with the examiner. But money leaves traces. When his spending began to draw attention, the FBI quietly opened a parallel investigation. They bugged his home, followed his car, and sifted through his trash. Each bag of discarded coffee filters and receipts painted a clearer picture. On February 21, 1994, as he left for work, agents surrounded him outside his Arlington home. The man who had gutted U.S. intelligence in exchange for wealth stood blinking in the morning light, as if waking from a long dream. Later, in court, when asked to explain why he had done it, Ames shrugged. "Greed and folly," he said. Nothing more. But the consequences of his betrayal had already rippled across the world. One of the men his information had exposed was a KGB officer named Oleg Gordievsky, the very man who, years earlier, had risked everything to warn the West about a crisis that could have ended civilization itself.
November 8, 1983, Moscow. The city was locked in its usual gray rhythm. Trams rattling through sleet, factory sirens echoing in the distance, but inside the Kremlin, panic was brewing. NATO had begun a large-scale military exercise called Able Archer 83, simulating the transition from conventional warfare to nuclear conflict. To the West, it was routine. To the Soviets, haunted by decades of suspicion, it looked like the opening move of World War III. In a dimly lit office in Yasenevo, Oleg Gordievsky read the cables with disbelief. The new KGB chairman, Viktor Chebrikov, had just circulated a classified memo warning that the West might be preparing a surprise nuclear first strike. Analysts were ordered to gather evidence, troop movements, intercepted communications, even shopping habits near NATO bases. To Gordievsky, it was madness. He had spent 2 decades watching his country's leaders interpret every Western gesture as a threat. Now they were ready to act on that fear. But Oleg Gordievsky was no longer loyal to them. Almost 10 years earlier, while stationed in Copenhagen, he had quietly agreed to cooperate with MI6. The decision had been born not from greed, but from conscience. He'd seen the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and the suffocating control of the state. He no longer believed in the system he served. So when British intelligence reached out, he accepted. His code name was Sunbeam. Now, in 1983, as the world edged toward nuclear confrontation, Gordievsky's position made him invaluable. He had risen to become resident, the KGB's top officer in London. From his office inside the Soviet embassy at Kensington Palace Gardens, he directed espionage operations across the UK, while secretly feeding MI6 a stream of Soviet intelligence. Every week, under the cover of late-night walks, he passed microfilm and reports to his handlers. The British saw him as one of the most important assets of the Cold War. That November, his reports became a lifeline. The Kremlin's paranoia over Able Archer was reaching a breaking point. Soviet air bases in East Germany and Poland went on high alert. Bombers were loaded with nuclear weapons. The West had no idea how close the world had come to catastrophe until Gordievsky warned them. His message was clear. The Soviet leadership genuinely believed an attack was imminent.
MI6 rushed the intelligence to Downing Street. Within hours, it reached Washington. President Reagan, shocked by the revelation, quietly ordered an immediate de-escalation. The exercise ended, the crisis passed, and the world exhaled without ever knowing how near the edge it had come. For a brief moment, Gordievsky believed he had made a difference, that he had helped avert a nuclear war. But in Moscow, suspicions were mounting. The KGB's counterintelligence branch had begun investigating leaks in the London resident Tura. Gordievsky's behavior, his Western mannerisms, his unguarded admiration for Britain had not gone unnoticed. Still, he continued to report to both sides, walking a line so thin that a single misstep could end his life. Then, in 1985, disaster struck. Unbeknownst to him, the KGB had been given his name. The source of that betrayal was the same man who had crippled American intelligence, Aldrich Ames. One May morning, Gordievsky received a cable ordering his immediate return to Moscow. Officially, it was for consultation. In reality, it was a trap. MI6 warned him not to go, but refusing would confirm his guilt. He boarded the plane. At Sheremetyevo Airport, officers from Directorate K were waiting. They drove him to a secure compound outside Moscow, where he was drugged, interrogated, and monitored for days. His captors demanded a confession, but lacking solid proof, they hesitated. Eventually, he was released, but under constant surveillance. He knew what that meant. His time was running out. Weeks later, he managed to signal MI6 using a prearranged code. A man standing at a specific Moscow street corner with a Safeway shopping bag. When the British confirmed the signal, Operation Pimlico went in motion, the most daring exfiltration in MI6 history. Gordievsky slipped away from his watchers, made his way to a rendezvous point near the Finnish border, and was hidden inside the trunk of a British diplomatic car. At the final checkpoint, a guard's dog began barking furiously at the rear of the vehicle. For a moment, it seemed over. Then the wife of one of the MI6 officers got out, opened the trunk, and changed her baby's diaper right there on top of it. The smell distracted the guards. The barrier lifted. Moments later, the car was racing across the border into Finland. Oleg Gordievsky had escaped the heart of the KGB itself. When he landed in London days later, he was greeted not with applause, but with quiet relief. His existence was now a state secret. The man who had once served the KGB at its highest levels would spend the rest of his life under British protection. His story, a whispered legend among intelligence officers. He had survived, but the empire he had betrayed was already beginning to crumble.
February 25, 1986. Moscow. A pale sun rose over the Kremlin towers as the Red Square loudspeakers crackled with the morning news. To the citizens shuffling to work, the broadcast was routine. To the men inside the Lubyanka, it was a warning. General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev had announced sweeping reforms, glasnost and perestroika, promising openness and restructuring. For the KGB, those words were dangerous. Openness was the enemy of secrecy. In the years that followed, the Soviet Empire began to unwind from within. The Afghan war had drained its treasury, oil prices had collapsed, and the satellite states of Eastern Europe were showing signs of revolt. For the first time since its creation, the KGB faced not foreign adversaries, but the slow implosion of the system it was sworn to protect. Inside Directorate S, the division responsible for deep-cover illegals abroad, agents received new instructions: tighten operations, minimize exposure, and destroy records linking Moscow to covert influence campaigns. Decades of espionage were buried in archives and microfilm reels sealed behind false walls. Some officers saw the writing on the wall and began looking for exit routes, quietly signaling to Western embassies. Others doubled down, insisting that reform was just another Western trick to weaken the state. In 1987, Gordievsky's intelligence continued to shape Western policy. His first-hand insights into Gorbachev's thinking helped guide Prime Minister Thatcher's cautious optimism and President Reagan's unprecedented dialogue with Moscow. Yet, even as détente took hold, the shadow war did not end. Espionage simply changed its form. Cybernetic research, microchip blueprints, and computer code replaced nuclear secrets. KGB operatives in the West infiltrated research firms and trade missions under the guise of scientific exchange. But within the walls of Lubyanka, fear still ruled. Senior officers worried that exposure of past assassinations and disinformation campaigns would destroy the service's credibility. The archives contained the ghosts of Operation Infection, forged documents, and hundreds of cases of foreign subversion. When East Germans tore down the Berlin Wall in 1989, KGB advisors in Dresden ordered the destruction of files. Among them was a young lieutenant colonel named Vladimir Putin, who watched helplessly as protesters surrounded his office. He would later call that night the moment he realized how fragile the Soviet Empire truly was. Across Europe, communist governments fell like dominoes. In Warsaw, Prague, and Bucharest, KGB-trained security services collapsed or defected. Old allies scrambled to rewrite loyalties. In Moscow, reform had become chaos. The power that had once flowed through the Lubyanka now leaked away to businessmen, generals, and ambitious politicians. The KGB's identity began to fracture. Some officers tried to reinvent the service as a modern intelligence agency. Others retreated into nationalism, convinced the West had engineered the Soviet collapse. By 1991, the tension broke. Hardline party members and KGB officers launched a coup against Gorbachev, hoping to restore control. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the soldiers refused to fire on their own people. Crowds flooded the streets. The coup failed in 3 days. The red flag above the Kremlin came down on December 25, replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. In the silence that followed, the once mighty KGB was dismantled. Its archives were split among new agencies: SVR for foreign intelligence, FSB for domestic security. Its officers scattered across governments, corporations, and organized crime networks. Some emigrated, others stayed, trading ideology for profit. But the methods survived. The culture of secrecy, surveillance, and manipulation endured, carried into the new Russian state by men who had grown up inside the KGB's iron discipline. They would rebrand, restructure, and modernize, but the mindset remained unchanged. The world outside was hostile, and only control guaranteed survival. For Gordievsky, watching from exile in London, it was bittersweet. The institution he had once served had collapsed, but its shadows still stretched across continents. In interviews, he warned that the habits of the old order would outlive the Union itself. "The system does not die," he once said. "It mutates." And he was right. As the 1990s dawned, the Soviet Empire was gone, but the operatives it trained, the files it kept, and the networks it built were still very much alive, waiting for a new era to call them back into play.
January 12, 1993. A low fog settled over Moscow, blurring the yellow glow of the street lamps outside Lubyanka Square. The massive stone building, the KGB's old headquarters, still loomed over the city, but the brass plaque on the entrance had changed. The new letters read FSB, Federal Security Service. Inside, the corridors were the same, the smell of paper and cold metal, the echo of boots on tile. Only the names on the office doors had shifted. The Soviet Union was gone, but its operatives hadn't disappeared. They'd adapted. Some had moved into private security or finance, using old contacts to amass quiet fortunes. Others stayed within the new intelligence structure, convinced that Russia's humiliation was temporary. Many of them were veterans of the Cold War, trained under the old KGB ethos of control and suspicion. Among them was a former mid-level officer from Dresden, pragmatic, loyal, and fiercely disciplined, Vladimir Putin. In those early post-Soviet years, Moscow was chaos. The economy collapsed, oligarchs rose overnight, and Western advisors flooded in with promises of reform. To the old guard, it looked like occupation. To men like Putin, who watched from the mayor's office in St. Petersburg, it was proof that the West's long war against Russia had simply changed shape. They believed the KGB had been right all along. The enemy never sleeps. The FSB inherited not just files and facilities, but doctrine. Surveillance of political opponents continued under new legal guises. Foreign influence operations were rebranded as information campaigns. Former KGB officers filled key roles in government ministries, corporations, and the press. The line between intelligence and statecraft blurred until it vanished entirely. The Spies' worldview became the foundation of national policy. Meanwhile, in the West, the myth of the KGB lingered like smoke. Hollywood turned it into legend: dead drops, cyanide pills, and trench coats in the fog. But the reality was less romantic. Thousands of lives had been crushed in secret prisons, and countless operations had warped history in subtle ways. The tunnels under Berlin, the false defections, the poisoned umbrellas, each was a piece of an invisible empire that had rewritten reality itself. In London, Oleg Gordievsky lived quietly under British protection. His hair had grayed, and his world had shrunk to guarded interviews and brief appearances at intelligence forums. He avoided the spotlight, but occasionally his voice would surface in print, reminding readers that the men who once served the KGB were not gone. They were simply waiting. By the late 1990s, those men began to re-emerge. In 1998, Boris Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin as director of the FSB. It was a symbolic resurrection. The intelligence community had returned to power. 1 year later, Putin became acting prime minister, then president. The KGB's sword and shield had found a new sheath in the Kremlin. Across the globe, Western intelligence services took note. Disinformation campaigns resurfaced under new names. Cyber units replaced typewriters, but the tactics were the same: divide, mislead, destabilize. Old operations like active measures were reborn for the digital age, amplified by the reach of the internet. In this new world, the ghosts of the KGB no longer needed forged passports or hidden transmitters. They had access to data, algorithms, and entire populations online. The front line had shifted from embassies to servers, from whispered conversations to social media feeds. And yet, the philosophy that guided it all hadn't changed since the dark days of Stalin and Serov. Control the narrative, control the enemy, control the truth. For those who had lived through the original Cold War, the Gordievskys, the defectors, the analysts, the realization was chilling. The empire had fallen, but its reflection still moved across the surface of the modern world, unseen yet unmistakable. In a London suburb, Gordievsky once said quietly to a BBC interviewer, "The KGB was not just an organization, it was a mindset. And that mindset still rules."
October 4th, 2010, London. Rain tapped softly against the window of a modest brick townhouse in the suburbs. Inside, Oleg Gordievsky sat at a wooden desk, piled with clippings and old notebooks. He was 72, retired in name only, still studying the patterns of power from afar. On his wall hung a faded photograph of a younger man in a Soviet uniform, himself decades earlier, smiling without understanding what that smile would cost. The KGB was gone, but its spirit, he often said, was alive in 1,000 offices under different names. Across the world, the descendants of that spirit were busy. In Moscow, the FSB had become one of the most powerful institutions in Russia. Many of its senior officers had begun their careers under the old Committee for State Security, trained in the same methods of surveillance, recruitment, and manipulation. They had replaced ideology with nationalism, but the tools were identical. Journalists were monitored, dissidents harassed, and former agents who spoke out often met quiet, violent ends. In London and Vienna, intelligence services tracked strange assassinations that carried the unmistakable signature of Soviet tradecraft. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer turned critic, was poisoned with polonium-210, a radioactive isotope traced directly back to a Russian reactor. The method was vintage KGB: precision, message, denial. When the British government confronted Moscow, the response was familiar: mockery, obfuscation, and silence. A decade later, in 2018, another defector, Sergei Skripal, was attacked with a nerve agent in Salisbury. Again, the pattern repeated. The weapon exotic, the motive political, the execution professional. The world was reminded that the ghosts of Lubyanka still walked the earth. These were not rogue acts. They were echoes of a system that had perfected the art of plausible deniability. Inside modern Russia, former intelligence officers filled parliament seats, chaired energy companies, and commanded oligarchic empires. They were the heirs of the Cold War's invisible elite, wielding power through secrecy rather than ideology. The West called it state capture. The KGB would have called it strategy. In Washington, the CIA's archives were still being combed for lessons from the failures of the Ames era. The betrayal had redefined internal security forever. Background checks deepened, finances scrutinized, and digital trails monitored. Yet the fundamental truth remained: a single disloyal insider could still compromise an entire network. Espionage had changed form, but not essence. The Cold War had ended without a treaty, without victory parades or surrender documents. Its real conclusion was marked not by fireworks, but by files, millions of them, stored in steel cabinets or destroyed in panic. The men and women who fought that invisible war faded into obscurity. Some died in silence, others wrote memoirs. A few, like Ames, served life sentences, their names synonymous with treason. Gordievsky, the man who risked everything to warn the world, lived in anonymity, his courage known only to those who understood what it meant to stand against one's own machine. His story became a cautionary legend in intelligence circles, a reminder that morality and duty often clash in the loneliest of places. As the 21st century unfolded, the game continued. Satellites replaced spies on rooftops, algorithms replaced informants, and the battleground moved from physical borders to digital firewalls. But the old lessons of the KGB still guided the playbook: control perception, exploit trust, weaponize information. The world Gordievsky had tried to save now existed in a permanent gray zone between peace and conflict, truth and illusion. He once told a journalist, "The war never really stopped, it only changed its clothes." In the end, history remembers the Cold War as a contest of ideology, but beneath that surface lay something far older and more human: the eternal struggle for power through secrecy. From Stalin's basement prisons to the data servers of modern Moscow, the same cold logic endures. Whoever controls the unseen world controls the world that follows. And so the curtain never truly falls. The names change, the flags change, but the operatives remain in the shadows, watching, waiting, just as they did in the long winter after 1945, when a new kind of empire was born from silence.